The morning smelled like motor oil and dry desert wind. It was a Friday, September 18, 1959, a stretch of Route 66 outside Tucumcari, New Mexico, one of those long, lonesome sections of highway where the road ahead looks identical to the road behind, and the horizon sits so far away it feels like a dare. Out there, a quarter-mile west of the Tucumcari town line, a gas station sat on the south shoulder of the road, the way it had sat every single morning since Franklin Roosevelt was in his first term. Two pumps, a two-bay garage with a poured concrete floor dark, with the memory of 1,000 oil changes, a small front office with a radio on the windowsill, a hand-lettered sign above the bay doors that read, in plain, unhurried letters, Mason and Son, Est, 1934. It was the kind of place that didn't try to be anything other than what it was. But on this particular Friday, something different was coming down Route 66. Not a customer, not a delivery. A long black Buick rolling in from the direction of Holbrook, followed close behind by a county truck with something heavy sitting on the passenger seat, a padlock. Earl Mason saw them coming from inside the office. He had a rag in his hand, same as always. He set it down on the counter next to his coffee cup. The coffee had gone cold, and he stood very still and watched the Buick pull up to his pumps. He already knew what it meant. He had been waiting for it, in the sick, slow way you wait for news you've already accepted in your bones even before your mind catches up. This is a story about what happened next. You have to understand who Earl Mason was before you can understand what this day cost him. Earl was 52 years old in the fall of 1959. Medium height, square shoulders, hands so permanently stained with grease that no amount of industrial soap ever quite reached the bottom of the creases. Gray at his temples, a burn scar across his right forearm he got in 1951 when a transmission caught fire on a customer's truck and Earl grabbed it barehanded because the customer's 12-year-old boy was standing too close. He never mentioned the scar. He didn't see any particular glory in it. It was just something that had happened, and then it was over, and the truck got fixed. His father, Wallace Mason, had built the station in 1934. That matters, because 1934 was not a gentle year to be building anything. The Depression had its teeth in the whole country. Wallace had been working as a track walker for the Santa Fe Railroad for years, walking the lines, checking the rails, doing the kind of bone-hard labor that pays just enough to keep you from starving. He had saved carefully, corner by corner, dollar by dollar, until he had enough to pour a concrete floor and bolt two pumps into the earth on the south side of Route 66. He chose that spot because he had watched long enough to see where the traffic slowed down. He was that kind of man, patient, observant, unhurried. He understood that a business built in the right spot could outlast almost anything if you were willing to tend it properly. Earl learned the work from his father the way most valuable things are learned, not from books, not from classrooms, but from standing beside someone who knew it and watching until your hands remembered what your eyes had seen. By the time he was 14, Earl could rebuild a carburetor. By the time he was 20, there wasn't a domestic engine on the road he couldn't diagnose by sound alone. Wallace died of a heart attack in 1948. Earl took over the station the very next morning. He didn't take a day. He couldn't afford one emotionally, and he didn't believe in them practically. The pumps didn't mourn. The road kept coming. Earl kept the bays open. He survived the Korean rationing years when fuel was short and customers were shorter. He worked through the winters when Route 66 went quiet, and the desert cold settled into the garage and made every metal tool feel like a punishment. In 1953, he rebuilt the engine on the Tucumcari fire chief's vehicle free of charge because the department was broke, and Earl figured a town that couldn't afford a working fire truck was a town in trouble. In 1955, Father Joaquin came through with a dying Hudson, and Earl fixed the carburetor and charged him cost on the parts and nothing for the labor. He paid the doctor bills when his wife Doris got sick, a 2-inch stack of them, envelopes arriving like unwelcome weather, paying them off one at a time, steadily, the way he did everything. And in the fall of 1958, he sent his son Tommy to New Mexico State University in Las Cruces, engineering. First Mason ever to go to college. The tuition was $150 a semester. Room and board was another $70. Earl paid it from the pumps, because that's all he had, and it was enough, barely, as long as everything else held steady. Everything else did not hold steady. In April of 1959, Phillips 66 doubled their wholesale fuel price on every station east of Albuquerque. Just like that. A letter in the mail, corporate letterhead, numbers that had rearranged themselves overnight into something Earl couldn't absorb without bleeding somewhere else. He didn't yell about it. He didn't drive to Albuquerque to argue with anyone. He sat with the letter at the counter, drank his coffee, and did the arithmetic on the back of a receipt. The arithmetic was not kind. In May, he missed his first mortgage payment to First National Bank of Holbrook. In June, he missed the second. He kept the pumps running. He kept the bays open. He changed oil and fixed brakes and replaced belts and did every job that came through the door. But the margin between what came in and what went out had been erased by the wholesale increase, and there was no recovering it on volume alone. Route 66 moved a lot of traffic in the summer, but not enough. Not with fuel costing what it now costs to stock the tanks. In August, a letter arrived from the bank. Final notice, it said, in the precise, bloodless language of institutions that have reduced human desperation to a filing category. Earl owed 6 months of back mortgage. He owed the August fuel bill to Phillips. The total was $2,300. The letter informed him that if the amount was not settled in full, the bank would initiate foreclosure proceedings. He didn't tell Doris the full number. He told her they were behind. She already knew. He didn't tell Tommy. Tommy was in Las Cruces starting his second year. Earl didn't see any reason to move a problem from his own shoulders onto his son's. That was not how Wallace Mason had operated, and it was not how Earl Mason operated either. He wrote back to the bank and asked for more time. The bank wrote back and told him when they were coming. September 18th, noon. Tommy had driven in from Las Cruces the day before. He knew something was wrong. Earl had sounded careful on the phone, the way careful men sound when they're holding something back. And Tommy had come home without being asked, because that's what sons do when they know, even if no one says it plainly. That morning, Tommy worked. He always worked when he came home. It was how he'd been raised. There was a truck in the second bay with a front-end problem, and Tommy had been underneath it since 8 o'clock, working with a wrench, getting his coveralls dark with grease, the way they always got when he was home. Earl worked the pumps. He filled tanks. He made change. He drank 2 cups of coffee from the pot on the windowsill and listened to Patsy Cline on the radio and did not allow himself to think too directly about what noon was going to bring. At the second pump sometime before 12, a battered red pickup pulled in for regular. The man driving it wore a tan Stetson and a faded denim work shirt, sleeves rolled to the forearms. He had the kind of face that carries its years honestly, neither trying to look younger than it is, nor dramatically aged. He pumped his own gas and stood by his truck and watched the road the way people watch roads when they're thinking about something else entirely. Nobody recognized him yet. At noon exactly, the black Buick arrived. The bank manager was a tidy man in a pressed suit. He stepped out of his car without any particular hurry, walked past Earl without greeting him, and set a manila folder on the counter inside the office. He read from a typed document, the legal language of dispossession in the flat, practiced voice of a man who has done this many times and has long since stopped hearing it. Notice of foreclosure. Mason's Service Station, Tucumcari, New Mexico. All operations to cease at 12:05 p.m. on this date. The property would revert to First National Bank of Holbrook pending sale. The sheriff of Key County was a 60-year-old man named Howard Gaines, who had been wearing that badge for 22 years. He stood at the office door with the padlock in both hands, shifting it from one palm to the other, looking at the ground. He had padlocked 31 stations in his career. He had never liked it once. Tommy came out from under the truck. He still had the wrench. He stood in the doorway to the second bay with the wrench in his greasy hand, and he looked at his father, and then at the bank manager, and then at the folder on the counter. Earl's hands were flat on the wood of the counter. He had the posture of a man absorbing a blow he saw coming. 8 more days, he said. Tommy goes back to school in 8 days. Let me work 1 more week. The bank manager closed the folder. 12:05. He turned and walked back to his car. At the second pump, the man in the Stetson hung the nozzle back in its cradle. He set a $5 bill on top of the pump and weighed it down with a piece of gravel from the apron. Then he stood there and watched, with the stillness of a man who is deciding something. Tommy came up beside his father at the counter. He set the wrench down very carefully, as if the sound of it mattered. Pop, Earl didn't turn. Pop, what do we do? Earl looked down at his hands, the hands that had learned everything they knew from Wallace Mason's hands. He said, "You go back to school. I'll figure something. There's no station to figure for. You go back to school." Tommy walked out through the bay door into the white September light. He went and stood by the empty grease pit with his back to the office and looked east at the long, pale highway running toward Amarillo, and he didn't say anything because there wasn't anything left to say. The man in the Stetson walked across the apron toward the office. Don't have words on the other side of them. Tommy walked across from the grease pit. He stopped beside his father. "Pop." Earl handed him the receipt without looking away from the man. Tommy read it. He read it twice. Then he looked up. "Have you ever had someone hand back to you? The thing you had already accepted was gone? Not halfway gone, not probably gone, but fully, finally, irretrievably gone. And then it was back? That moment doesn't just change the afternoon. It changes something in the architecture of how you understand the world." The man walked toward his pickup. Earl followed him. "Mr. Wayne." The name came out quiet, almost involuntary, as if it had arrived in Earl's mind and his mouth hadn't thought to check whether to say it. John Wayne stopped. He was 52 years old, same age as Earl Mason. He turned and looked at him. Earl said, My father took me to see Stagecoach in Albuquerque in 1939. Drove 190 miles to see it. Said it was the finest picture he ever saw in his life." John Wayne touched the brim of his Stetson. He had good taste. A pause. "Mr. Wayne, I cannot accept. It isn't a gift, sir." Wayne opened the door of his pickup and paused, one hand on the frame. "It's a loan, $2,300. Pay me back when the road comes around. No interest, no schedule. Send a check to my agent in Encino when you can spare it." He took a small notebook from his shirt pocket and wrote an address on a blank page. Tore the page out, handed it to Earl. "Charles Feldman, famous artists, Beverly Hills. Pay it back. That's the only condition." Earl took the page. His hand steadied after one small shake. "Mr. Wayne, I will pay you back if it takes the rest of my life." "I know you will." Wayne got in the truck. He pulled the door. He started the engine. It coughed once and then found its rhythm, a low, even rumble. He put his hand on the steering wheel. Then he leaned back out the window. "One more thing." Earl stepped closer. "That boy of yours." Wayne nodded toward Tommy, still standing at the edge of the apron with the receipt in his hand. "Engineering school, don't let him quit. The country's going to need engineers a lot longer than it's going to need movie stars." He put the truck in gear. He could have written a check from Encino in the morning. He could have left after paying. He could have done the thing and gone without the conversation. Instead, he leaned out of the window one final time and reached his hand toward Earl Mason and gripped it once, the way men gripped hands in the years when that was the fullest thing you could offer, hard, brief, unambiguous, and then let go. He pulled out onto Route 66 and turned west. The dust rose behind the rear tires and hung in the afternoon light, golden and slow, the way desert dust hangs when the air is dry and there's no wind to hurry it along. Earl Mason stood at the edge of his apron and watched the red pickup until it was a small dark shape against the white sky. Then he kept watching after it was gone. Tommy came and stood beside him. Neither of them spoke for a long time. The radio was still off. The coffee was still cold. The receipt was in Tommy's hand. The pumps were still there. Earl Mason paid John Wayne back. It took him 6 years. He didn't do it in a single payment. He couldn't. But he did it the way he did everything. Steadily, consistently, one envelope at a time. $40 in November 1959, $60 in March 1960. 100 after the snowbirds ran east in the spring of 1961, just as he had told Wayne they would. Letters came back from Charles Feldman's office, each one signed by a secretary, each one acknowledging receipt. He never missed a payment he said he would make. It had not been a legal obligation. It had not been a contract with enforcement. It had been a handshake on a concrete apron in Tucumcari, New Mexico, in September 1959. And for Earl Mason, that was the only kind of contract that mattered. Tommy Mason graduated from New Mexico State University in 1962 with a degree in mechanical engineering. He went to work for Sandia National Laboratories in Albuquerque. He married a woman from Las Cruces in 1964. He became exactly the kind of engineer John Wayne said the country was going to need, the kind who worked on things that mattered. Quietly and without fanfare, the way his father had worked pumps on a desert highway for 27 years. In the spring of 1965, Earl mailed the last payment, $110. He wrote a brief note with it, not a letter, just a few lines saying the total was paid. A week later, a thick envelope arrived from California. Inside was everything. Every money order, every check. Every one of them returned, uncashed, in a single brown envelope, with a typed letter on plain white paper. No letterhead, nothing official, just a piece of paper with 3 sentences on it. Earl, I never cashed any of it. The loan was paid the morning your boy walked across that stage in Las Cruces. Keep the station running. J.W. Earl Mason ran Mason service until 1981. He was 74 years old when he finally stepped back from the pumps. He didn't close the station. He handed it to Tommy, who had bought the property from his father in 1965, the same year the uncashed checks came back, and then signed it immediately back over as a gift on Earl's 60th birthday. The transfer contract carries both their signatures. Earl added a handwritten note in the margin, in his careful, unhurried script, Ode to John Wayne, paid in full by the man himself, September 18, 1959. John Wayne died on June 11, 1979, in Los Angeles. He was 72 years old, stomach cancer, a disease he had fought with the same stubborn, undemonstrative resolve with which he had apparently conducted himself on a Thursday afternoon in Tucumcari 20 years before. He never mentioned the gas station to any reporter. He never wrote about it in any letter that has since come to light. Charles Feldman, his agent, died in 1968, and whatever files he kept went with him. There are no studio records, there are no press clippings. There is no anecdote sourced from a friend of a friend who heard it at a dinner party. It appears to have been something Wayne did, and then set aside entirely, the way certain people set aside good things they've done because they were never doing them for the record in the first place. In 1992, Tommy Mason, 62 years old, recently retired from Sandia, drove to the Tucumcari Route 66 Museum on the corner of Route 66 and South 1st Street and donated 3 items to their collection. The first, a heavy black iron padlock on a steel chain, Key County stamping on the side. It had never been used. Howard Gaines, when he retired in 1963, had removed it from his county truck and left it in his garage, and eventually it had found its way to Tommy, who felt it belonged somewhere that would understand what it represented. The second, a black and white photograph taken on September 18, 1959, by Doris Mason with a Kodak Brownie camera. It shows 2 men standing beside a battered red pickup at pump number 2. One is Earl Mason. One is a tall man in a Stetson, whose face, if you know it, is unmistakable. Tommy is visible in the background, holding a wrench. Neither man in the foreground is smiling. Both are looking at the camera with the expression of men who were not entirely sure they wanted to be in a photograph. Honest, unposed, a little tired, the way real moments look when they haven't been arranged for an audience. The third, the 1965 transfer contract, Mason to Mason, with Earl's handwritten note in the margin. The display sits in a glass case under the museum's south window. Every afternoon at approximately 3 o'clock, the sun clears the frame of the window and falls directly on the padlock and the photograph and the folded contract. It lights them for about 20 minutes. The padlock going warm and dark, the photograph suddenly vivid, the ink of Earl's note catching the light, and then the sun moves on, and they go back to being artifacts in a case in a